Every woman believes her mate will protect her, shield her, stand between her and a world designed to destroy the weak. But what happens when the man who swore to honor you becomes the first one to throw you to the wolves? When the pack you bled for turns their backs the moment you need them most? This is the story of how a royal weapon learned that survival doesn't ask permission. It takes what it needs and burns everything else to ash. Stick around until the end to see how far a woman will go when she's got nothing left to lose. And if you're watching from your city tonight, drop its name in the comments and hit that like button. Let me know who's brave enough to hear how empires really fall. The Grand Hall of House Valkyrin stank of old money and older lies. Selene Veyra stood perfectly still at the center of the obsidian floor, her silk gown the color of dried blood, her hands clasped before her like a prisoner awaiting sentence. Around her, 200 nobles whispered behind jeweled fingers, while torchlight painted shadows across marble columns that stretched toward a vaulted ceiling lost in darkness. She could feel their eyes on her skin. Hungry, judging, waiting. At 23 years old, she had already spent 5 years as King Lucian Drakhar's favorite instrument of truth. 5 years sitting beside the throne like some exotic pet, touching the hands of accused traitors while their secrets spilled into her mind like poison into an open wound. 5 years watching men beg for mercy seconds before the king's executioners dragged them screaming into the courtyard. She told herself she was protecting the kingdom. She told herself the guilty deserved what they got. She told herself so many lies that she almost believed them. Almost. A sharp voice cut through the murmuring crowd. Bring forth the prisoner. King Lucian Drakhar rose from his throne, a monument of black iron and silver wolves that seemed to devour the light around it. He was tall, built like violence wrapped in expensive fabric, with silver eyes that could strip the courage from a man's chest just by looking at him. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that belonged in old paintings of vengeful gods. Beautiful, terrifying, utterly in control. He descended the 7 steps from the dais with the kind of grace that made people forget he'd murdered his way to that crown. When he spoke, his voice carried across the hall without effort, smooth as silk pulled over a blade. Tonight, we judge a man who forgot what loyalty means. The massive doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. 6 royal guards dragged a man in chains across the polished floor, his boots scraping stone with every forced step. Blood matted his dark hair. Bruises covered his face like storm clouds. But even beaten half to death, even shackled like an animal, Selene Veyra moved like a wolf that hadn't quite forgotten how to bite. Selene's breath caught in her throat. She knew this man. Everyone in the Empire knew this man. Former war general. Exiled Alpha. The traitor who'd supposedly led thousands of soldiers to slaughter at Ravenspire Pass before vanishing into the wilderness like smoke. For 3 years, Lucian had hunted him. For 3 years, the king's best trackers had combed the northern territories, burning villages that might have sheltered him, executing anyone who whispered his name with anything other than hatred. And now here he stood, bleeding on the palace floor, while the entire court held its breath. Lucian circled Selene slowly, studying him the way a man might study a painting he was considering destroying. General Veyra. The king's voice dripped with false civility. Or should I say former general, since you traded your commission for cowardice and ran while better men died in your place. Selene lifted his head. His face was a mess of split skin and swelling, but his eyes, dark, furious, unbroken, locked onto Lucian without flinching. You want to talk about better men? His voice came out rough, damaged, but steady. Then let's talk about the ones you sacrificed because their families had too much influence. Let's talk about how you sent 3 battalions into an ambush you knew was waiting. Let's talk about the supply lines you cut so they'd starve before the enemy even reached them. The hall erupted. Nobles gasped. Guards shifted. Someone near the back shouted that Selene should have his tongue cut out for speaking to the king that way. Lucian raised one hand and silence crashed down like a hammer. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that promised suffering. Selene, my dear. His gaze found her across the crowd. Come show this liar what truth looks like. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Training, obedience, 5 years of conditioning that turned commands into instinct. She crossed the space between them, her slippers whispering against stone, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. When she reached Selene, she stopped. Up close, he was bigger than she'd expected. Broader. His presence filled the space around him like heat from a fire, even chained and bleeding. He smelled like pine forests and old violence. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Or warning. She couldn't tell. Touch him, Lucian commanded softly. Show them the poison in his mind. Selene's gift had rules, simple ones, skin contact, focus, and then the flood. Memories didn't come in order. They came in fragments, sensations, emotional weather patterns that crashed through her consciousness like drowning in someone else's skin. Usually it lasted seconds, long enough to catch the shape of guilt or innocence before the connection broke. She reached for Kaelin's hand. His fingers were rough, calloused from weapons and hard living, warm despite the chains. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded. Pain first, not physical, deeper. The kind of pain that comes from watching people you love die while you're powerless to stop it. Soldiers screaming in a narrow pass while arrows fell like rain. Brothers in arms bleeding out in mud while supply wagons that should have been there weeks ago rotted in a depot 200 miles south because someone had ordered them held back. She saw Kaelin on his knees in the blood-soaked snow, cradling a dying man who couldn't have been more than 19. Saw him realize the ambush wasn't enemy intelligence. It was orchestrated, calculated. The supply delay too precise to be coincidence. The troop positions too exposed to be accident. Then, betrayal. The sick realization that the king himself had engineered the massacre to eliminate rival bloodlines whose alphas were gaining too much support among the military ranks. 3 families erased in a single battle. Their heirs dead. Their influence gone. Their territories ripe for absorption into the crown's direct control. She saw Kaelin confronting Lucian in a private chamber, voice shaking with rage. Saw the king's cold smile. Saw the moment Kaelin understood he'd signed his own death warrant by speaking the truth. And finally, rage. White-hot, barely controlled, the kind of fury that could burn down kingdoms if given enough air. But underneath it, something else. Grief. Bone-deep sorrow for the men who died believing their king valued their lives. But no treason, no cowardice, no guilt. Just a man who discovered his king was a monster and refused to stay silent. Selene jerked her hand back like she'd touched hot iron. Her breath came in short gasps. The hall swam around her, torchlight blurring into streaks of gold. Her legs felt weak, her stomach churned. Around her the court waited, every face turned toward her expectantly. Lucian's voice cut through her shock. "Well?" She looked at the king, really looked at him for maybe the first time in 5 years, saw the calculation in his silver eyes. The cold mathematics of a man who'd already decided Kaelin's guilt before the chains ever touched his wrists. The casual cruelty of someone who viewed people as tools to be used until they broke. Saw the way he stood with absolute confidence that she'd confirm whatever story he needed, because she always had. For 5 years she'd been the perfect weapon, sharp, obedient, never questioning the hand that wielded her. Saw the monster wearing a crown. Her mouth opened, closed, the words stuck in her throat like broken glass. Every eye in the hall burned into her skin. She could feel the weight of expectation crushing down. The court wanted blood, wanted justice, wanted the comforting lie that their king protected them from men like Selene Veyra. But she'd seen the truth. And the truth was that Selene Veyra was the only honest man in this room. Her voice came out quieter than intended, but in the silence it carried like a bell. "He believes he acted for the kingdom." The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Not innocent, not guilty, just enough ambiguity to keep Kaelin breathing for another few hours. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something sharp and dangerous. The kind of look a wolf gives when it realizes the rabbit it's been chasing might have teeth. He stepped closer to her, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "Careful, Selene. Mercy looks too much like weakness, and weak things don't survive long in this palace." Then louder, for the crowd. "Take him to the tower. We'll continue this tomorrow when our truth seeker has had time to rest." Sometimes fractured minds require multiple readings. The guards hauled Kaelin away. He didn't fight, didn't speak, just locked eyes with Selene one more time as they dragged him toward the doors. And in that gaze she saw something that made her chest tighten. understanding, like he knew exactly what she'd just risked to buy him time. The assembly dissolved into chaos. Nobles arguing in tight clusters, guards shouting orders, servants rushing to clear wine goblets and prepare the hall for whatever fresh horror tomorrow would bring. Selene stood frozen in the center of it all, her hands shaking, her gift screaming warnings she was only just beginning to understand. She'd lied to the king. For the first time in 5 years, she'd used her power to protect someone instead of condemn them. And Lucian knew it. An elderly duchess approached her, face pinched with concern. "My dear, are you quite well? You look pale." Selene forced a smile that felt like breaking. "Just tired." The reading was more difficult than usual. "You poor thing." The woman patted her arm with jeweled fingers. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be easier once the traitor confesses." The casual certainty in her voice made Selene want to scream. These people had no idea, no concept of the machinery they fed with their silence. They attended these tribunals like theater, watching men die while drinking expensive wine, convinced that justice and spectacle were the same thing. She excused herself and fled to her chambers, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The rooms Lucian had given her were beautiful in the way prisons could be beautiful if you decorated them expensively enough. Silk curtains, marble floors, windows that overlooked the city but didn't open far enough for a person to fit through. She'd never questioned it before, never noticed how the doors locked from the outside, never thought about why she needed guards posted in the hallway at all hours, supposedly for her protection. Protection from what? Or protection from whom? She crossed to the window and stared out at the city sprawling below the palace. Thousands of lights flickering in the darkness like stars that had fallen and couldn't get back up. Somewhere down there, people believed the king protected them, believed justice lived in these marble halls, believed power and righteousness were the same thing. She'd believed it too once, before she'd touched enough minds to see the pattern, before she'd watched Lucian orchestrate conflicts just so he could crush them publicly, before she'd realized that every traitor she exposed happened to be someone standing between the king and greater control. A merchant whose trading company had too much influence in the southern ports. Dead. A nobleman whose daughter had rejected Lucian's marriage proposal. Dead. A general whose soldiers loved him more than they feared the crown. Dead. She'd helped kill them all. Not with her hands, with her gift, with her silence, with her willingness to believe that serving the throne meant serving the kingdom. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been Lucian's weapon for so long that she'd forgotten weapons could choose not to fire. A knock at her door made her jump. "Come in." A servant entered, eyes downcast, carrying a silver tray with a sealed letter. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, thin as hunger, with bruises on her wrist that looked like fingerprints. She set the tray on the table and turned to leave. "Wait." Selene's voice stopped her. "What's your name?" The girl froze, clearly terrified of being noticed. "Mara, my lady." "How long have you worked in the palace, Mara?" 3 years, my lady." Selene studied her, saw the way she kept her gaze down, the way her hands trembled slightly, the carefully blank expression that people learned to wear when showing emotion could get them hurt. "Are you treated well here?" The question seemed to confuse her. "I serve the crown, my lady." "It's an honor." The words came out flat, rehearsed, the kind of answer that kept people alive in places where honesty was dangerous. Selene felt something crack deeper in her chest. "You can go," she said softly. The girl fled like she'd been released from a trap. Selene broke the wax seal on the letter. The king's personal mark stared up at her like an accusation. The note was brief. "My chambers, midnight. We need to discuss your hesitation." Her blood turned to ice water. She had 4 hours. 4 hours to decide if she was brave enough to keep lying to the most dangerous man in the empire. 4 hours to figure out if there was any path forward that didn't end with her head on a spike outside the palace gates. She tried to eat and couldn't, tried to sleep and failed, tried to convince herself this was all a misunderstanding and knew she wasn't that good a liar. Finally, the bells tolled midnight. She climbed the spiral stairs to the obsidian tower, each step feeling like walking toward her own execution. The tower sat at the palace's highest point, a black needle piercing the sky, where Lucian conducted the business too dark for public halls. 2 guards flanked the door. They let her pass without a word, their faces carefully empty of expression. Inside, firelight painted gold across walls made of volcanic glass that seemed to swallow sound. The room overlooked the entire empire through floor-to-ceiling windows. Snow drifted past the glass like funeral ash. Lucian stood with his back to her, staring out at his kingdom. He'd removed his ceremonial armor. Now he wore simple black, but somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. Like seeing a wolf without its fur and realizing the muscles underneath. Close the door. She obeyed. The lock clicking shut sounded impossibly loud. He didn't turn around. Do you know what I see when I look at this city? His voice was quiet, almost conversational. I see 200,000 people who would tear each other apart if I wasn't here to keep them in line. Merchants who'd poison their competitors. Nobles who'd start civil wars over inherited titles. Soldiers who'd massacre civilians for the contents of their pockets. He finally turned to face her. Chaos is the natural state of humanity, Selene. Order is the aberration, and order requires force. Constant, unrelenting force. The moment you show weakness, the moment you hesitate, everything falls apart. Is that what you think you are? She heard herself ask. Order? His eyes narrowed slightly. I think I'm the only thing standing between this empire and complete collapse. Every man I execute, every house I destroy, every threat I eliminate before it can grow. Those aren't cruelties. They're necessities. Surgery to cut out the cancer before it spreads. He crossed the space between them slowly, deliberately. And you, my dear, are my most valuable surgical tool. That gift of yours cuts through deception better than any blade. So when you stand in my hall and lie to me about what you saw in a traitor's mind, it's not just betrayal. It's sabotage. I didn't lie. The words came out steadier than she felt. No? Lucian tilted his head, studying her like an insect under glass. Then tell me what you really saw when you touched Selene Veyra. This was the moment, the cliff edge. She could step back, apologize, confirm whatever story Lucian wanted, and maybe survive another day as his weapon. Or she could jump. I saw a man who discovered you orchestrated the massacre at Ravenspire Pass, who realized you sacrificed 3 battalions to eliminate rival families, who tried to tell the truth and was destroyed for it. The silence that followed was absolute. Lucian's expression didn't change, didn't shift, but something happened behind his eyes, something cold and final, like a door closing. When he spoke, his voice was soft. I see. He moved to a cabinet against the wall, poured 2 glasses of wine with steady hands, and offered her one. She didn't take it. He shrugged and drank from both, proving neither was poisoned. Let me tell you a story, Selene. When I was 17, my father ruled this empire. He was a good king, just fair, merciful to his enemies. And you know what happened? They killed him, slowly, publicly. They made him watch while they executed my mother, my sisters, my younger brother. Then they cut him apart piece by piece in the palace square while the crowd cheered. He set down the glasses. I learned something that day. Goodness is weakness. Mercy is suicide. The only way to survive as a ruler is to make everyone more afraid of you than they are of chaos. So yes, I orchestrated Ravenspire Pass. I eliminated 3 families whose alphas were popular enough to challenge me. And I'd do it again tomorrow if I needed to. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to help me finish what I started. Tomorrow, you'll stand before the court. You'll touch Selene Veyra again, and this time you'll tell them he's guilty, that you saw treason in his mind, that he deserves execution, and if I refuse, then I'll make you watch while I execute every servant in this palace who's ever shown you kindness, every guard who's ever smiled at you in the hallway. That girl who brought you the letter tonight, what was her name? Mara? I'll start with her. Make it slow. Make sure you can feel every second of her death through that gift of yours. Selene felt the blood drain from her face. You're a monster. No. Lucian's voice was perfectly calm. I'm a king. There's a difference. Monsters destroy without purpose. I destroy with exquisite precision. Every death serves the crown. Every elimination strengthens the empire. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the absolute certainty in his silver eyes. You think Selene Veyra is a hero? He's a fool. He put principles above survival, and look where it got him. Beaten, chained, waiting to die. That's what happens to people who care more about truth than power. They lose. She met his gaze without flinching. At least they stay human. Something flickered across Lucian's face. Anger, maybe. Or hurt. It was gone too fast to read. "Get out!" His voice was ice. "You have until dawn to decide. Condemn Kaelin and continue serving me. Or refuse and watch everyone you've ever cared about suffer before I finally kill you too. Choose carefully." Selene walked to the door on legs that felt like water. As she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her. "One more thing. The escape tunnel you used to free Kaelin, did you really think I didn't know about it? I've had guards watching the catacombs since he arrived. They're tracking him right now. By morning, they'll bring him back in pieces." Her heart stopped. "Unless," he smiled, "unless you convince me tomorrow that you're still useful. Condemn him publicly, and I'll call off the hunt. He gets to run. You get to live. Everyone wins. You're lying. Maybe. But can you afford to take that chance?" The door closed behind her. She stood in the hallway, shaking, her mind racing. Lucian had known. About the tunnel. About her helping Kaelin escape. He'd let it happen just to see what she'd do. Just to test her loyalty one more time. And now she had a choice that was really no choice at all. Condemn an innocent man and keep feeding the machine that ground people into dust. Or refuse and watch everyone she cared about die before Lucian finally killed her too. She walked through the silent palace in a daze. Past guards who wouldn't meet her eyes. Past servants who pressed themselves against walls as she passed. Past rooms where she'd sat beside the throne for 5 years, helping a monster tighten his grip on an empire too terrified to resist. She reached her chambers and locked the door behind her, stood at the window staring out at the city while her mind raced in circles that led nowhere good. There had to be a way out, some path she wasn't seeing, some angle that didn't end in death or damnation. But the more she thought, the clearer it became. Lucian had built a trap with no exits. Every choice led to horror. Every path ended in blood. Unless. The thought hit her like lightning. What if the only way out was through? What if instead of running, instead of hiding, she did exactly what Lucian expected, but twisted it in a way he'd never see coming? The plan formed slowly, dangerously, a strategy built from desperation and rage in equal measure. It would probably kill her. It would definitely destroy everything Lucian had built. But if she was going to die anyway, she might as well make it count. She sat at her desk and began writing. Names, evidence, everything she'd gathered in 5 years of sitting beside the throne while Lucian destroyed his enemies. Every conversation she'd overheard, every secret she'd pulled from guilty minds, every piece of proof that the king was exactly the monster she'd finally admitted he was. She sealed the documents in wax and hid them in a place Lucian would never think to look. Then she lay down on her bed and waited for dawn. Outside her window, the city began to wake. Merchants opening shops, servants lighting fires, guards changing posts, the machinery of empire grinding forward like it always did, crushing whoever got caught in the gears. But tomorrow, she was going to throw a wrench into that machinery. Tomorrow, she was going to stand before the entire court. And instead of touching Kaelin's hand, she was going to touch the king's. She was going to show every noble in that hall exactly what Lucian Drakhar really was. Every murder, every manipulation, every calculated atrocity committed in the name of order. She was going to burn his empire to ash using his own weapon against him. The revelation would probably kill her instantly. Lucian's guards would cut her down before she finished exposing him. But the truth would be out. The court would see. And once they saw, they couldn't unsee. The throne would fall, even if she didn't live to watch it. For the first time in 5 years, Selene felt something like peace. She'd been a weapon for so long, shaped by fear and obedience into a tool that cut exactly where Lucian pointed. But weapons didn't choose. Weapons didn't rebel. Weapons didn't burn down empires to save strangers. Tomorrow, she'd prove she was something far more dangerous. A woman who'd finally learned the difference between power and control. And once she understood that truth, even kings couldn't stop her. The city bells tolled 5 times. Dawn was an hour away. Selene rose, washed her face, and dressed in the same blood-red gown she'd worn the night before. She braided her hair with steady hands, applied dark color to her lips like war paint, looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she'd forgotten existed. Not a weapon, not a tool, just a woman who'd decided that some things were worth dying for. The door to her chamber opened. Guards stood outside, summoned by Lucian to escort her to the hall. She walked between them with her head high, her heart steady, her gift burning in her chest like a caged star waiting to explode. The grand hall was already packed, every noble family, every alpha of significance. The entire court assembled to watch Selene Veyra receive the judgment they all knew was coming. Lucian sat on his throne wearing black ceremonial armor that made him look like death itself. He smiled when he saw her. Confident, certain, already tasting his victory. He had no idea what was coming. Selene took her place at the center of the hall. The doors opened. Guards dragged Selene forward. He looked worse than yesterday. Fresh bruises. New cuts. They'd beaten him again during the night, making sure he'd be too weak to fight. But when his eyes found hers across the hall, she saw the same unbroken defiance burning there. The same refusal to bend that had kept him alive through 3 years of running. Lucian rose from his throne. Selene Veyra, his voice rang out across the hall. You have had time to complete your reading. Tell this court what you saw in the mind of the traitor Selene Veyra. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward her. This was it, the moment everything changed. Selene drew a deep breath. Then she looked straight at Lucian and spoke words that would either save the kingdom or destroy it completely. I cannot give you the reading you want, my lord. Not until I verify something first. Lucian's smile faltered. Verify what? Whether the guilt I see belongs to the man in chains. She began walking toward the throne. Or to the man who put him there. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Lucian stood very still. What are you doing? Selene climbed the 7 steps to the dais. Stood before the throne. Before the king. Before the monster she'd served for 5 years while telling herself it was justice. I'm going to touch your hand, she said quietly. And I'm going to show this entire court exactly what you are. His face went white. For the first time since she'd known him, Lucian Drakhar looked genuinely afraid. Don't! She grabbed his wrist, and the truth exploded across the grand hall of House Valkyrin like wildfire, devouring everything in its path. The moment Selene's fingers closed around Lucian's wrist, the world shattered. Not physically. Worse. Psychically. Her gift tore into his mind like a blade through rotted silk, ripping past every defense he'd spent decades building, every wall designed to keep his darkness contained. And because they stood at the center of the grand hall, because 200 nobles surrounded them in a perfect circle, because her power had never been stronger or more desperate, the truth didn't stay contained between them. It exploded outward. Every person in that hall felt it slam into their consciousness like a fist through glass. The first thing they saw was the queen, Lucian's wife, dead for 7 years. The official story said illness took her, a wasting sickness that even the best healers couldn't cure. But Selene dragged the real memory into the light like a corpse from deep water. The queen hadn't been sick. She'd discovered the truth about Ravenspire Pass, found the orders Lucian had written himself, deliberately routing supply lines away from the front, ensuring 3 battalions would starve before enemy forces even arrived, found the ledgers showing which noble families lost heirs in that massacre, found the mathematical precision of his genocide, and she'd confronted him. The memory played out in brutal clarity across the consciousness of everyone present. Lucian standing in their private chambers while his wife begged him to stop, told him she'd go public if he didn't confess, threatened to expose everything. So he poisoned her wine himself, sat beside her bed for 3 days while the toxin ate through her organs, held her hand while she died in agony, whispering apologies that meant nothing because he'd do it again if he had to. Then he stood before the empire and wept such convincing tears that half the kingdom sent condolences. The hall erupted in screams. Nobles stumbled backward, hands pressed to their heads, trying to block out the psychic assault and failing. Several dropped to their knees. An elderly duchess vomited onto the marble floor. Guards drew weapons reflexively, unsure what they were fighting, but Selene wasn't done. She dragged deeper, pulling out every atrocity Lucian had committed and throwing it into the shared consciousness like acid. They saw him orchestrate the assassination of his own brother when the young prince grew too popular with the military. Saw him burn villages that refused to pay impossible taxes. Saw him manufacture rebellions in loyal territories just so he could crush them publicly and seize their lands. They saw what he'd done to Selene herself. The night he'd discovered her gift. She'd been 18, Working in a tavern in the outer districts, she'd accidentally touched a merchant's hand and seen his plan to poison a business rival. Told the city guard. Saved a life. Lucian heard about it within hours. He came for her himself. Didn't ask, didn't offer. Just had his guards drag her screaming from her home while her mother begged them to leave her daughter alone. He imprisoned Selene in the palace. Spent months breaking her will through isolation and fear. Told her she had a choice: serve him willingly or watch him execute everyone she'd ever loved, starting with her mother. She was 19 when she finally stopped fighting, 19 when she touched her first accused traitor and realized the man was innocent but condemned him anyway because Lucian demanded it. 19 when she became a weapon. The hall descended into absolute chaos. A duke near the front drew his sword and lunged toward the throne, screaming about murdered sons. Two other nobles tackled him before he reached the steps. Somewhere in the back, fighting broke out between families whose blood feuds Lucian had secretly orchestrated. And through it all, Selene held onto Lucian's wrist with grip strength born from 5 years of rage. She could feel him trying to pull away, feel his gift activating, his alpha nature surging, his body beginning the transformation that would let him tear her apart. But she'd learned something in 5 years of touching minds. Fear made people slow. And Lucian was absolutely terrified, his silver eyes locked onto hers with something she'd never seen there before. Genuine human emotion. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible under the screaming. "Please stop." "Why?" Her voice came out steady despite her racing heart. "You never stopped for anyone else. I'll give you anything. Power. Freedom. Name it. I want the truth." She pulled deeper, past the murders and manipulation, past the calculated atrocities, down to the raw core of what drove him. And there, buried under 30 years of paranoia and violence, she found it. Fear. Bone-deep existential terror that had lived inside Lucian Drakhar since the day he watched his family die. He'd been 17. His father's enemies had stormed the palace during a coup attempt. They'd lined up the royal family in the throne room, made young Lucian watch while they executed his mother, his sisters, his baby brother. They saved his father for last, cut him apart slowly while the crowd cheered. Then they turned to Lucian, bleeding, traumatized, broken. And one of the coup leaders put a blade to his throat and whispered, "You live because you're weak, because you're no threat, because you'll never be strong enough to matter." That night created the monster. Not the violence itself, the humiliation, the crushing weight of being dismissed as irrelevant while his family's blood pooled at his feet. So Lucian spent the next 3 years rebuilding himself, learning to fight, learning to manipulate, learning to become the kind of threat that no one would ever dismiss again. He killed his way back to the throne, every person involved in the coup, every noble who'd stood by and watched, every citizen who'd cheered while his family died. He made the executions public, made them spectacular, made sure the entire empire understood that the weak boy they'd spared had become something infinitely more dangerous. And once he had the power, once he wore the crown, once he stood at the center of everything he'd lost, he made a decision that sealed his fate. He decided he would never be weak again, never vulnerable, never human enough to hurt. So he became the thing he feared most. He became the tyrant, the monster, the king who ruled through terror because terror was the only thing strong enough to protect him from ever feeling that helpless again. Every execution was armor. Every manipulation was a wall. Every atrocity was him proving over and over that he wasn't that broken 17-year-old boy bleeding on the throne room floor. And the sickest part, the thing that made Selene's gift scream in recognition, was that somewhere deep down, Lucian knew exactly what he'd become. Knew he'd turned into the same kind of monster that had destroyed his family. Knew he'd sacrificed everything human inside himself, chasing a feeling of safety that would never actually come. Knew he was trapped in a prison of his own making, unable to stop, unable to trust, unable to be anything except the weapon he'd forged himself into. But he couldn't stop. Because stopping meant admitting he'd become the villain for nothing, that all those deaths, all that suffering, all those years of paranoia and violence had been pointless, that he destroyed himself and everyone around him chasing a ghost. The revelation broke something in the hall, because suddenly Lucian wasn't just a monster. He was a human who'd made himself into a monster, and somehow that was worse. Monsters you could hate cleanly. Monsters you could fight without guilt. But a man who'd turned himself into a monster out of fear? A king who'd built an empire on suffering because he was too broken to imagine any other way to feel safe? That was tragedy, wearing a crown. Selene felt tears burning down her face. Not for Lucian, for every person he'd destroyed, for every life he'd ended trying to fill the void where his humanity used to live. For the girl she'd been at 18, before he'd turned her into a weapon. For the weapon she'd become, believing it was the only way to survive. She released his wrist and staggered backward. The psychic connection shattered. The hall fell into shocked silence. 200 nobles staring at their king with expressions ranging from horror to disgust to something dangerously close to pity. Lucian stood frozen on the dais, his face white, his hands shaking. For the first time in 15 years of rule, he looked small, human, afraid. A duke near the front found his voice first. "You murdered your wife." Lucian didn't respond. "You killed my son at Ravenspire Pass." Another noble stepped forward, voice shaking with rage. "You sent him to die so you could steal my family's territories." Still nothing. "How many?" A woman in the back, her voice breaking. "How many people have you murdered?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Lucian's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Selene with something that might have been betrayal or might have been relief. "All of them," he said finally. His voice came out hollow. "Everyone who threatened the crown, everyone who questioned me, everyone who made me feel weak." The admission landed like a death sentence. Guards shifted uncertainly, unsure whether they were still protecting their king or holding back a lynch mob. Then Kalen spoke. He was still chained, still bleeding, still barely able to stand, but his voice carried across the hall with absolute clarity. "You're under arrest, Lucian Drakhar, for treason against the Empire, for the murder of Queen Isadora, for the massacre at Ravenspire Pass, for crimes too numerous to list." Lucian laughed. It was a broken sound, jagged, wrong. "Arrest me?" He looked around at the assembled nobles. "Who's going to enforce that?" "You?" He pointed at the duke who'd lost his son. "You spent 10 years bowing to me, accepting my coin, marrying your daughters into families I approved. You knew what I was. You all knew. You just didn't care as long as your own positions were secure." The accusation hit like a slap. Because it was true. Every person in that hall had benefited from Lucian's rule, had used his paranoia to eliminate their own rivals, had watched innocents die and done nothing because speaking up would have made them targets. They'd all been complicit, all willing participants in the machine that ground people into dust. And now that the truth was exposed, now that they couldn't pretend ignorance anymore, they had a choice. Stand with the monster they'd enabled, or destroy him and pretend they'd always been on the side of justice. Selene watched the calculation happen in real time across 200 faces, saw the moment they decided. "Guards," the Duke commanded, "arrest the king." The guards didn't move. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the captain of the royal guard stepped forward, a man named Matthias who'd served Lucian for 12 years, who'd carried out executions, burned villages, eliminated threats on the king's orders. He drew his sword and pointed it at Lucian's chest. "I serve the Empire," he said quietly, "not the man who broke it." That was the crack that shattered the dam. 6 more guards drew weapons, then 10, then 20. Lucian stood alone on his throne, surrounded by steel, and for the first time in his life had nowhere to run. His eyes found Selene across the chaos. "You did this?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because someone had to." Her voice didn't shake. "Because you taught me to be a weapon, but you forgot that weapons can choose where they cut. I made you everything you are." "No." She shook her head. "You made me everything I was. I'm making myself into something new." Lucian's face twisted into something ugly. "You think this changes anything? You think exposing me makes you a hero? You were my instrument for 5 years. You have blood on your hands, same as me. The only difference is I never pretended to be good." "You're right." The admission seemed to surprise him. "I do have blood on my hands. I helped you destroy innocent people because I was too afraid to refuse, too weak to fight back, too convinced that survival meant obedience. So what makes you different now?" I stopped lying to myself about what I was becoming. The guards closed in. Lucian looked at them with something like sadness. Then his body exploded into transformation. Fur erupted across his skin, bones cracked and reformed. His clothes tore as he shifted into his wolf form, a massive black creature with silver eyes that radiated barely controlled rage. The guards fell back. Even chained, even bleeding, even surrounded, an alpha in wolf form was death on 4 legs. Lucian snarled, a sound that vibrated through the marble floor. Then he lunged, not at the guards, at Selene. Because if he was going down, he was taking his weapon with him. The world slowed. Selene saw the beast coming, saw the murder in those silver eyes, knew she didn't have time to run or dodge or do anything except accept that this was how it ended. She'd destroyed the king. Now the king would destroy her. Fair trade. But Kalen had different ideas. The chains holding him shattered. Not broke. Shattered. Like they'd been made of glass instead of iron. His own transformation came faster than thought. Silver fur. Massive shoulders. Eyes that burned with 3 years of rage that finally had a target. He intercepted Lucian mid-leap. The 2 wolves collided in mid-air with a sound like thunder. They hit the marble floor in a tangle of claws and teeth and fury, rolling across the polished stone while nobles scattered screaming. The fight was primal, savage, personal in a way that transcended politics or justice. This was 2 alphas with nothing left to lose tearing into each other like the world would end if they stopped. Lucian fought like a king terrified of losing everything. Kalen fought like a soldier protecting something worth dying for. Blood splattered across white marble. Fur tore free in clumps. The sound of breaking bones echoed through the hall. Selene watched, frozen, unable to look away. This was her fault. Her choice. Her rebellion that had brought them to this moment. If Kalen died here, it would be because she'd forced this confrontation before anyone was ready. The wolves crashed into a pillar hard enough to crack stone. Lucian recovered first, lunged for Kalen's throat, but he made one critical mistake. He went for the kill instead of the victory. Went for the dramatic execution instead of the practical elimination. Because after 30 years of ruling through spectacle, Lucian had forgotten how to fight without an audience. Kalen twisted at the last second. Lucian's jaws closed on fur instead of flesh. And in that half second of exposure, Kalen struck. His teeth found the soft junction where Lucian's neck met his shoulder. Bit down. And tore. Blood fountained across the throne room floor. Lucian stumbled backward, his massive wolf form shuddering, his silver eyes going wide with shock. He'd never expected to actually die. Never imagined the story could end this way. He'd been so certain of his own invincibility that death caught him completely unprepared. His legs gave out. He collapsed at the base of his own throne, transforming back into human form as consciousness faded, his blood pooling beneath him in a spreading dark mirror. His eyes found Selene one last time. She couldn't read the expression there. Accusation, maybe. Or regret. Or just the dull surprise of a man realizing he'd built his entire life on foundations of sand. His mouth moved, shaping words that no sound came out to carry. Then his eyes went empty. The king was dead. The hall fell into absolute silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Everyone just stared at the body bleeding out on the marble while reality slowly caught up to what they'd witnessed. Kalen shifted back to human form, naked and covered in blood that was only partially his own. Someone threw him a cloak. He wrapped it around himself without looking away from Lucian's corpse. "It's over," he said quietly. But Selene knew better. King's dying wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of the real nightmare. Because power didn't vanish when the person wielding it died. It just scattered, fragmented, turned into 1,000 smaller conflicts as everyone who'd been held down by fear suddenly realized they could fight back. She could already see it starting. Nobles clustered in tight groups, whispering urgently. Guards eyeing each other with new suspicion, wondering who'd take command now that the chain of authority had shattered. Servants huddled near the walls, terrified of being caught in whatever violence came next. The empire was about to tear itself apart. Unless someone stopped it. Kalen seemed to realize the same thing. He climbed the steps to the dais, his movements slow and careful, and stood beside the throne without sitting in it. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 3 years surviving in the wilderness on nothing but will and spite. Lucian Drakhar is dead. His crimes are exposed. The question now is what happens next. A nobleman near the front, a duke whose family controlled the southern territories, stepped forward. The throne stands empty. The succession laws are clear. The crown passes to the nearest blood relative in the Drakhar line. There are no blood relatives. Lucian made sure of that when he murdered his brother. Then the throne passes to the ruling council, to the noble houses who enabled every horror Lucian committed? Kaelin's voice went hard. Who watched innocent people die and did nothing because it protected your positions? You want to know what happens next? I'll tell you. We burn the old system to ash and build something that actually serves the people instead of feeding on them. The Duke's face went red. You have no authority to... I have the authority of everyone in this hall who's sick of being ruled by fear. Kaelin looked around at the assembled nobles. Lucian was right about one thing. You all knew what he was. You all benefited from his violence. So here's your choice. Help build something better, or get out of the way and let the people who actually suffered under his rule decide what comes next. You can't dismantle the entire... Watch me. The confrontation balanced on a knife edge. Selene could feel the tension crackling through the hall, could see nobles calculating whether they could take Kaelin down before he consolidated power, could sense the violence building like pressure before a storm. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward, walked to the center of the hall, and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. Everyone had felt what her gift could do. They'd all experienced the psychic assault that had exposed Lucian's crimes. They were terrified of her now. Good. Fear could be useful if you aimed it correctly. I spent 5 years as Lucian's weapon. 5 years condemning people I knew were innocent. 5 years telling myself that serving the crown meant protecting the kingdom. She looked around at the assembled nobles. I have blood on my hands. Real blood. Real deaths. People who are gone because I was too afraid to refuse. The hall was silent. I can't undo that. Can't bring them back. Can't wash away the guilt. She took a breath. But I can make sure their deaths meant something. I can use the gift that Lucian twisted into a weapon and turn it into something else. Something that actually serves justice instead of power. What are you proposing? The Duke asked warily. A truth council. She met his gaze without flinching. Every noble family, every territory, every major house sends a representative. And before they're allowed to sit on that council, they let me touch their hands. Let me see what crimes they've committed, what deals they've made, what blood they've spilled in the name of their own advancement. You can't possibly... Watch me. The echo of Kaelin's words landed like a hammer. No more secret executions. No more midnight murders. No more people disappearing because they questioned authority. From now on, power gets held accountable. Truth becomes law. And anyone who refuses to submit to that reading forfeits their right to rule. The implications spread through the hall like wildfire. She was proposing to do to every noble family what she'd just done to Lucian, to expose every dark secret, every hidden crime, every carefully buried atrocity, to tear down the entire aristocratic system and rebuild it on foundations of forced honesty. It was radical, dangerous, possibly insane, and absolutely necessary. Because the old way had created Lucian. The old system of secret deals and quiet murders and power protecting power had enabled 30 years of tyranny. The only way to prevent another king like him was to make sure no one could accumulate that kind of unchecked authority again. A younger nobleman, someone Selene vaguely recognized from the outer territories, stepped forward. I'll submit to the reading. The Duke rounded on him. You can't be serious. You're going to let her rifle through your mind like... I have nothing to hide. The young man looked at Selene steadily. My family stayed loyal to the crown because we believed in order, in structure. If I'd known what Lucian really was, I'd have fought him myself. So yes, I'll prove that with a reading, if that's what it takes. Others began stepping forward. Not many, but enough. The ones who were genuinely clean, or clean enough, or too terrified of being exposed later to refuse now. The Duke looked around at the fracturing consensus and realized he'd lost. This is madness. No, Selene said quietly. This is accountability. And if you're afraid of that, it tells us everything we need to know about what you've been hiding. She turned to face the entire assembly. The Empire is broken. We all know it. Lucian broke it. We helped him. And now we have a choice. We can fight over the scraps and tear each other apart in civil war. Or we can build something different, something that actually protects people instead of grinding them up for profit. The hall remained silent, but the quality of that silence had shifted. Less hostile, more uncertain. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't end in everyone dying. Kaelin descended from the dais and stood beside her. Together, they faced down an empire. Two people who'd been destroyed by the system, rebuilt themselves in the wreckage, and decided to burn the whole thing down rather than let it keep destroying others. The moment stretched. Then the captain of the guard stepped forward and knelt. "I'll serve the Truth Council." 6 more guards joined him. Then servants began kneeling, the ones who'd been invisible furniture for decades, who'd watched atrocities happen and been powerless to stop them. Then some of the younger nobles, the ones who'd inherited their positions but hadn't yet had time to get their hands too dirty. The tide was turning. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough that Selene felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. The Duke who'd challenged them stood alone in his defiance for another moment. Then he turned and walked out of the hall, his footsteps echoing on marble. 3 other families followed him. "Let them go," Kaelin said quietly. "They'll either come around or they won't. But we're not building the new empire on force. That's what Lucian did. So what do we build it on?" Choice. The word hung in the air like a promise. Selene looked at the people still kneeling, looked at the blood drying on the marble, looked at Lucian's corpse still sprawled at the base of the throne he'd died trying to protect, and she made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the throne, placed her hand on its cold iron surface, and spoke words she'd never imagined saying. "This throne dies with Lucian. No one sits here again. No one rules alone. No one gets to accumulate this much power ever again." She turned to face the hall. The empire survives, but the monarchy ends today. The declaration landed like an earthquake. Somewhere in the back, someone started weeping. From relief or grief, Selene couldn't tell. Kaelin stepped beside her. "We have a lot of work ahead, a lot of damage to repair, a lot of families to answer to. It's going to be ugly and complicated, and there's no guarantee it works." "But it's better than this," Selene finished. Their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them. Not just recognition, not just shared trauma. A bond. The kind that forms when 2 people survive the same hell and decide to build something better from the ashes. The kind that would either save them both or destroy them together. Selene turned back to the assembled court. "Anyone who wants to help rebuild, stay. Anyone who can't accept the old ways dying, leave now. No judgment, no punishment, just go." A dozen more families filed out, but 30 stayed. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. Enough to start. Enough to try. Enough to maybe, possibly, against all odds, create something that wouldn't require weapons like Selene to function. The sun rose outside the palace windows, painting the hall in gold light that made the blood on the floor look black. A new day. A new empire. Built on truth instead of fear. If they could keep it from collapsing before they finished laying the foundations. Selene looked at Kaelin. He looked back. Neither of them spoke, but the question hung between them like smoke. Now what? The first 3 weeks after Lucian's death felt like building a house during an earthquake. Every day brought new crises, territories threatening secession, noble families demanding immediate answers about property seizures that happened years ago, merchants refusing to pay taxes to a government they didn't recognize, guards who'd served Lucian choosing exile over serving the new council. Selene barely slept. She spent 16-hour days reading minds, settling disputes, dragging secrets into daylight whether people wanted them there or not. Her gift had become the foundation of everything they were building. The only thing holding the fragile piece together was the knowledge that lies couldn't survive contact with her hands. It was exhausting in ways that went deeper than physical fatigue. Every mind she touched left residue. Guilt, fear. Memories that weren't hers but clung to her consciousness anyway. She started having nightmares about crimes she'd never committed, waking up in cold sweats trying to remember which atrocities were Lucian's and which belonged to the nobles she'd read that day. Kaelin noticed. He found her one night in the archives, surrounded by reports she was supposed to be reviewing, staring at nothing while her hands shook. "You need to rest." She didn't look up. "Can't. The Northern Territories are threatening to break away unless we give them trade concessions. The merchant guilds want guarantees about..." "Selene," His hand on her shoulder made her flinch. He pulled back immediately, concern written across his face. "When's the last time you ate?" She tried to remember and couldn't. "That's what I thought." He crossed to the door and spoke quietly to a servant in the hallway. Within minutes, food appeared. Simple stuff. Bread, cheese, fruit that actually looked fresh. Selene picked at it without appetite. "They're going to tear it apart," she said quietly. "Everything we're trying to build. The families that left are spreading rumors that we murdered Lucian in a power grab. Half the territories don't believe the truth reading was real. They think I'm just another manipulator using a convenient gift to seize control. Are they wrong?" The question startled her into looking at him. Kaylin's expression was serious but not accusing. "I mean it. Are we any different than Lucian? We're forcing our vision of justice on an empire whether they want it or not. We're using your gift as a weapon to consolidate power. We killed the king and took over. How is that not exactly what tyrants do? Because we're trying to give power back instead of hoarding it. Are we, though? Or are we just telling ourselves that while we build a different kind of cage?" The words hit harder than they should have, because part of her had been thinking the same thing late at night when sleep wouldn't come, wondering if they'd really changed anything or just replaced one form of control with another. The only difference was their intentions were good, but Lucian had probably believed his intentions were good too, probably convinced himself that every atrocity served some greater purpose. That's how it worked. How good people turned into monsters one compromise at a time. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I don't know if what we're doing is right. I just know it's better than what we had. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's the best I've got." Kaylin sat down across from her, his presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. There was something between them. Had been since that moment in the dungeon when she'd freed him. An awareness that went deeper than gratitude or shared trauma. Something that felt like fate pressing down on both of them, waiting to see if they'd accept it or fight it. Neither of them had addressed it directly. Too much else happening. Too many crises demanding attention. Too dangerous to add personal complications to an already impossible situation. But it was there. Growing stronger every day, they worked side by side, trying to hold an empire together with spit and determination. "We should talk about what happens next," Kaylin said finally. Meaning the council meets in 2 days. They're going to push for formal leadership structure. Someone has to make final decisions when the group deadlocks. So we vote. They're going to want a single authority, someone who can act quickly in emergencies. Selene felt ice in her stomach. They want a new king. They want stability. Structure. Something that looks like the old system enough that people don't panic. And what do you want? His eyes met hers. "I want to make sure we don't recreate the same nightmare with different faces. Then we refuse. We hold the line on collective governance. No single ruler, no concentrated power. Even if that means the empire fragments? Even if territories break away and we end up with civil war?" Yes. The conviction in her voice surprised them both. Because here's what I learned from 5 years beside Lucian's throne. Power doesn't corrupt people. It reveals them. It takes whatever is already broken inside and amplifies it until it destroys everything around them. The only way to prevent that is to make sure no one person ever holds enough power to break the world. Kaylin studied her for a long moment. "You sound like you've been thinking about this a lot, every night. Every time I close my eyes and see the people I helped Lucian destroy. Every time someone thanks me for exposing the truth, while I'm standing there knowing I spent 5 years burying it. You were a prisoner. I was a coward. There's a difference. You were surviving. By becoming his weapon." She shook her head. "I don't get to use fear as an excuse, not after what I did. The best I can do now is make sure the system can't create another me, can't take someone's gift and twist it into a tool for tyranny." "Is that why you're pushing so hard? Because you're trying to punish yourself?" "Because I'm trying to mean something." The words came out raw, honest in a way she hadn't intended. Kaylin reached across the table and took her hand. The contact sent a jolt through her. Not her gift activating. Something else. Something that felt like recognition on a level deeper than psychic power. "You already mean something. Not enough. Not yet." "Then let me help carry the weight." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with something that had nothing to do with politics or empire building. Selene pulled her hand back. Not because she wanted to, because getting close to people was dangerous when you could read their minds with a touch. Intimacy became complicated when you couldn't help but see every dark thought, every buried resentment, every moment of doubt. I should get back to work. It's 3 a.m, then I should sleep. She stood too quickly. The room spun. Exhaustion and malnutrition catching up with her all at once. Kaylin caught her before she hit the floor. And because he was touching her, because her defenses were down, because she was too tired to maintain the walls she usually kept between her gift and the world, she felt it. The flash of his emotions, concern, attraction. Something deeper that felt like the early stages of the bond they'd both been avoiding acknowledging. But underneath it, something else. Doubt. Not about her, about the whole enterprise, about whether they could actually rebuild an empire or if they were just delaying the inevitable collapse. He was afraid they were going to fail, afraid that everything they were sacrificing would amount to nothing, afraid that he was leading her into disaster because he didn't know how to do anything except fight, and she deserved better than a broken soldier pretending to be a statesman. The honesty of it stole her breath. She pulled away quickly before she could fall deeper into his mind. "I'm fine, just tired." Liar. But he let her go. She made it back to her chambers and collapsed into bed, still wearing her clothes. Sleep came eventually, and with it, nightmares. She woke before dawn with her heart racing and sweat soaking through her shirt. The dreams had been worse than usual. Lucian's memories mixed with her own, creating a grotesque tapestry of violence where she couldn't tell where his guilt ended and hers began. She gave up on sleep and went to the baths. The palace had private bathing rooms for high-ranking officials. Marble pools fed by underground hot springs that turned the water pleasantly warm. She'd been using them since taking up residence in what used to be Lucian's inner circle quarters. Felt strange, wrong, like wearing a dead man's clothes. But there weren't many other options in a palace designed for concentrated hierarchy. She sank into the water and let the heat work at the knots in her shoulders, tried not to think about Kaylin's doubt, tried not to wonder if he was right to be afraid. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. She tensed, reaching for the robe she'd left on the bench. The door opened. A woman entered, mid-40s, sharp features, expensive clothes that marked her as nobility even without the family crest embroidered at her collar. Selene recognized her. Lady Morgana Tessith, head of one of the oldest families in the Empire, one of the first to pledge support for the new council. One of the nobles Selene hadn't read yet because there were too many and not enough hours. "Lady Tessith." Selene kept her voice neutral. "This area is supposed to be private." "I know." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I needed to speak with you away from the council chambers. Somewhere we wouldn't be overheard." Alarm bells started ringing in Selene's head. "Whatever you need to say can wait until—" "No, it really can't." Morgana moved closer to the pool's edge, her posture relaxed but her eyes calculating. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did to Lucian, for exposing him, for giving those of us who were tired of his tyranny an opening to act." The phrasing was wrong, off. An opening to act, not an opening to heal, not a chance to rebuild. An opening, like they'd been waiting for the right moment. Selene's gift started screaming warnings. "I'm glad the truth came out," she said carefully. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I also wanted to give you an opportunity. One chance to make the smart choice before everything becomes much more complicated." "What are you talking about?" Morgana's smile turned cold. "The council meets in 2 days. When they do, you're going to stand before them and read my mind. And when you do, you're going to tell them I'm clean, that my family has no secrets worth exposing, that we're loyal to the new order and can be trusted with significant power in the restructured government." Selene stood up, water streaming off her, reaching for her robe. "I don't lie about readings. That's the whole point. Everyone lies, dear. You're just used to being able to catch them. But what happens when the lie comes from the one person everyone trusts to tell the truth? You're asking me to become exactly what Lucian made me. I'm asking you to be practical. My family controls the eastern territories, the shipping routes, the grain supplies that keep the capital fed. If you expose the wrong things about us, those territories will break away. The food shipments will stop. And the new government you're trying to build will collapse under starvation and civil war within 6 months. So you're threatening me. I'm explaining reality. You have power, Yes, that remarkable gift. But gifts are useless without the infrastructure to support them. And that infrastructure belongs to families like mine. We own the roads, the ports, the warehouses, the merchant contracts that keep goods flowing. Selene's mind raced. This was the problem they'd known was coming but hoped to avoid. The entrenched power structures that couldn't be dismantled without breaking everything that depended on them. Morgana stepped closer. Here's what's going to happen. You read me. You tell everyone I'm clean. I use my influence to keep the Eastern Territories stable and cooperative. Everyone wins. The alternative is you expose whatever secrets you find in my head. I pull my support, and you watch the Empire tear itself apart while you stand there with your precious principles and nothing else. The worst part was that she might be right. If the Eastern Territories seceded, if the food supplies got cut off, the capital would descend into riots within weeks. Everything they'd built would collapse, and all because Selene insisted on telling the truth. But if she started lying now, if she let one corrupt family stay in power because it was convenient, what was the point of any of this? Where did the compromises stop? How many deals with devils did it take before you became the devil yourself? I need to think about it. You have until the council meeting. Choose wisely. Morgana left as silently as she'd arrived. Selene stood alone in the bath chamber, dripping water onto marble, her hands shaking with rage and fear, and the horrible realization that she was trapped. Either way, people suffered. Either she compromised her principles and became another tool for the powerful, or she held the line and watched innocent people starve in the chaos that followed. Lucian had built this trap years ago, had constructed an empire so dependent on corrupt power structures that trying to tear them down meant destroying everything. And now she was standing in the ruins trying to figure out which poison would kill slower. She dressed mechanically and went to find Kalen, found him in the training yard behind the palace, working through sword forms with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than thought. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? She told him. All of it. Morgana's threat. The impossible choice. The realization that exposing every corrupt noble might cause more damage than letting some of them stay in power. Kalen's expression went hard. She's bluffing. The Eastern Territories aren't going to starve their own people just to spite us. Maybe not. But they might secede. Form their own government. Take half the empire with them. And then we're right back to the fractured kingdoms that existed before the Drakhar line unified them. Centuries of progress lost because I insisted on perfect justice. So what are you going to do? I don't know. The admission felt like defeat. Kalen sheathed his practice blade. Let me read her instead. Use whatever truth speakers the Eastern Territories trust. Prove her guilt through someone she can't threaten. And if she's telling the truth about the food supplies, if exposing her really does lead to famine, then we find another way to feed the capital. We open trade with the southern kingdoms. With what leverage? We're barely holding together as it is. We don't have the political capital to negotiate new trade agreements, so we let her blackmail us. The question hung between them like a blade. Selene felt something breaking inside her chest. The idealism that had carried her through exposing Lucian, the certainty that truth was always the answer, the belief that they could build something clean from the ashes of tyranny, all of it cracking under the weight of reality, because this was what ruling actually meant, not grand declarations and moral clarity, impossible choices, broken promises, doing harm to prevent worse harm, and never being certain you made the right call. What would you do? She asked quietly. Kalen was silent for a long moment. I'd probably let her get away with it. Make the pragmatic choice, save lives today, and worry about principles tomorrow, and hate yourself for it. Yeah, he met her eyes. Every single day. They stood in the training yard while the sun climbed higher, and guards changed shifts, and the palace machinery ground forward like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The revolution was eating itself. The noble families who'd supported them only did so because they saw an opportunity for their own advancement. They didn't want truth and justice. They wanted Lucian gone so they could fill the power vacuum he left behind. And Selene had been naive enough to think exposing one king would somehow cleanse an entire system built on corruption. I'm going to read her, she said finally, and I'm going to tell the truth, whatever it is, whatever it costs. Even if it means famine? Even then. Because the moment I start lying to protect the powerful is the moment I become Lucian's weapon again, And I'd rather burn the empire to ash than go back to that. Kaelin studied her face. You really mean that? Yes. Then I'll stand with you. When the territories break away and the food runs short and people start rioting, I'll be right there helping you deal with the consequences. Why? Because somebody has to. And because I think you might be the only person in this entire palace who still remembers what we're supposed to be fighting for. The council meeting happened 2 days later in the great hall where Lucian had died. They'd cleaned the blood, but the marble still held faint stains. Permanent evidence of violence no amount of scrubbing could erase. 50 representatives filled the chamber. Nobles, merchants, military commanders, territory leaders. The fragile coalition that was supposed to rebuild the empire. Morgana sat in the front row, wearing confidence like armor. Selene took her position at the center. The rules were simple. Every person seeking significant power in the new government had to submit to a reading. Full transparency. No secrets, no hidden agendas. Most had already gone through it. The ones with relatively clean records or small enough sins that exposing them wouldn't break anything important. But Morgana had delayed, found excuses, claimed scheduling conflicts. Now her turn had finally come. She stood and approached with the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty she'd already won. Held out her hand. Selene hesitated. This was the moment. The choice that would define everything that came after. Compromise and survive. Hold the line and watch everything collapse. She took Morgana's hand. The flood hit immediately, but it wasn't what she expected. Not corruption, not the usual noble sins of bribery and backroom deals and murdered rivals. Something worse. Morgana had been one of the coup leaders who'd killed Lucian's family 30 years ago, had stood in the throne room while they executed children, had helped orchestrate the massacre that turned a 17-year-old boy into the monster who'd ruled through fear for 3 decades. And then, when Lucian consolidated power and started hunting everyone involved, Morgana had hidden, stayed quiet, played loyal noble while secretly undermining him at every opportunity. Not out of guilt, out of ambition. She'd spent 30 years positioning her family to be ready the moment Lucian fell. Building trade monopolies, securing territory control, creating the infrastructure stranglehold she'd threatened Selene with. All of it calculated, all of it planned. She'd helped create Lucian, let him become a tyrant, enabled his worst instincts, then waited patiently for the right moment to sweep in and claim power in the aftermath. Selene saw it all in crystalline detail, saw deeper, saw that Morgana had known Selene would expose her, had counted on it, because the reading would reveal her crimes but also reveal the leverage she held. The eastern territories, the food supplies, the economic stranglehold that made her untouchable. Exposing her wouldn't lead to justice. It would lead to exactly what she'd threatened. Secession, famine, collapse. Morgana had engineered a trap with no escape. Either Selene lied and became the weapon Lucian had shaped her into, or she told the truth and helped Morgana prove that truth was useless against real power. Either way, corruption won. Selene released her hand and stepped back. The hall waited in silence, every eye on her. This woman helped murder King Lucian's family 30 years ago. She spent 3 decades building economic leverage specifically to make herself untouchable regardless of what crimes might be exposed. Gasps erupted across the chamber. Morgana's smile never wavered. And she's right. The Eastern Territories will secede if we move against her. The food supplies will stop. The capital will starve. Everything we're trying to build will collapse. The hall descended into chaos. People shouting, demanding explanations, calling for Morgana's arrest, calling for Selene's head for admitting they were trapped. Selene raised her voice above the din. But here's what I realized. The reason people like Lady Tessith always win isn't because they're smarter or stronger. It's because good people keep accepting their compromises, keep making deals with devils and telling themselves they'll fix it later. She turned to face Morgana directly. So we're not making a deal. We're not letting you leverage innocent people's hunger to protect your power. Instead, we're going to do something radical. Morgana's smile faltered. We're going to tell the Eastern Territories the truth, all of it. We're going to send riders to every town and village explaining exactly what you did, who you really are, what you're threatening to do to them if they don't support your power grab. And then we're going to let them choose. You can't... Watch me. Selene looked around at the assembled council. This is the moment we decide who we are, whether we're actually building something new or just rearranging deck chairs on Lucian's ship. If we compromise now, if we let one corrupt family stay in power because it's easier than fighting, we're doomed. We'll spend the rest of our lives making the same calculation until we can't even remember what we were fighting for. The hall was silent. So here's the choice. We expose Morgana. We help the Eastern Territories build new trade infrastructure that doesn't depend on one family's stranglehold. We accept that it's going to be hard and people are going to suffer in the short term. But we hold the line on the principle that corruption doesn't get rewarded just because it's inconvenient to fight it. Or we make the deal. We let her stay in power. We become exactly what we overthrew, and we spend the rest of our lives wondering when the next Lucian will rise because we were too afraid to actually change anything. Kaylin stood. I vote we expose her, deal with the consequences, build something real, even if it's harder. Others began standing. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. The merchants who'd been crushed under noble monopolies. The soldiers tired of fighting wars engineered for profit. The servants who'd spent their lives invisible and powerless. The people who actually needed the system to change because the old way was killing them. They stood with Selene. And Morgana finally understood she'd lost. Not because truth overpowered leverage. Because Selene had called her bluff and turned the Eastern Territories into allies instead of hostages. You're making a mistake, Morgana said coldly. Without my family's infrastructure, we'll build new infrastructure. Better infrastructure that serves people instead of enriching tyrants. You'll fail. Maybe. But we'll fail trying to do the right thing instead of succeeding at perpetuating the same nightmare. Guards moved to arrest Morgana. She didn't resist, just smiled that cold smile one more time. This isn't over. There are 20 families just like mine, all of them with leverage, all of them waiting to see if you'll really hold the line or if this is just performance. The moment you show weakness, the moment you compromise, they'll know. And they'll tear you apart. Let them try. The guards led her away. The hall erupted in arguments, half the nobles storming out, some in support of Morgana, others terrified of being read next and having their own leverage exposed. Kaylin approached Selene while chaos swirled around them. You know this might actually destroy everything. I know. And you're okay with that? She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and still chose hope over surrender. I'm not okay with anything, but I'd rather die building something worth having than live maintaining something rotten. That's the only choice that makes sense anymore. He took her hand. This time she didn't pull away. Let the psychic connection form. Let him feel her fear and determination and bone-deep exhaustion. Let him see exactly what this was costing her. And when he didn't flinch away, when he held on tighter instead, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not safety. They were too far past safety for that. But maybe something better. Partnership. The knowledge that whatever horrors came next, she wouldn't face them alone. The Eastern Territories seceded 3 days later. Food shipments stopped immediately. Within a week, bread prices in the capital tripled. Within 2 weeks, riots broke out in the merchant district. And Selene stood in the palace looking out at the city while it burned and wondered if Morgana had been right after all. If truth was just another luxury only the privileged could afford, if she'd destroyed the empire trying to save it, if every person who starved in the coming months would have their death on her conscience alongside everyone she'd helped Lucian kill. But she didn't compromise, didn't make the deal, didn't become the weapon again, even when it would have been easier, even when it would have saved lives. Because some transformations couldn't be reversed. Once you became the thing you hated, once you crossed that line, there was no walking it back. And Selene had already spent 5 years being Lucian's instrument. She wouldn't spend another day being anyone's weapon. No matter what it cost, no matter who it killed, even if the person it killed was her. The capital burned for 11 days straight, not metaphorically, literally, flames eating through the merchant district while rioters smashed storefronts and dragged warehouse owners into the streets, demanding food that didn't exist anymore. The Eastern Territories had cut off grain shipments exactly as Morgana promised they would, and hunger turned civilized people into animals faster than Selene had thought possible. She stood in the council chamber watching smoke rise over the city while 20 remaining representatives screamed at each other about whose fault this was. Your principles are killing people, a northern duke shouted across the table. Every day you refuse to negotiate with the Eastern families is another day children starve in the streets. So we should reward treason? A merchant guild leader shot back. Let families who helped murder the royal line 30 years ago keep their stranglehold on trade because it's convenient. The arguing spiraled into accusations and counter-accusations, while the city outside descended further into chaos. Kalen stood beside Selene, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. This isn't working. No, she agreed quietly. It's not. Maybe we should… Don't! She cut him off before he could finish. Don't say we should compromise. Don't say we should make the deal. Because the moment we start down that road, we never stop. Every crisis becomes an excuse to abandon our principles until we can't even remember what they were. People are dying. People were already dying. Under Lucian. Under the system that created him. At least now they're dying for a chance at something better instead of just feeding the machine that grinds them up. You really believe that? She met his eyes. I have to. Because if I don't, if I admit that maybe Morgana was right, and truth is just a luxury only the powerful can afford, then everything I've done becomes meaningless. Every person I condemned for Lucian, every execution I enabled, every atrocity I participated in, it all becomes just waste. Just suffering for nothing. The weight in her voice made the entire council chamber fall silent. Everyone turned to look at her. She hadn't meant to become the center of attention, but here she was anyway. The weapon who'd learned to aim herself. The truth speaker who'd exposed a king and inadvertently started a civil war. The woman who was either going to save the empire or destroy it completely. No middle ground. No safe compromises. Just the terrifying clarity of standing at the edge of the abyss and having to choose which way to jump. She took a breath and addressed the council. The Eastern territories are counting on us to break. They're betting that hunger will force us to accept their terms, that we'll cave and let corrupt families keep their power because the alternative is too painful. So here's what we're going to do instead. The room leaned forward. We're going to break their monopoly. We're going to open direct trade negotiations with the southern kingdoms that have been trying to establish commercial relationships for years. We're going to offer them favorable terms in exchange for immediate grain shipments. And we're going to build new roads and ports that bypass the eastern infrastructure entirely. That will take months, someone protested. People will starve before… Then we ration what we have. We open the palace stores. We redistribute noble family hoards. We take every advantage the powerful have been hoarding, and we spread it across the population until the crisis passes. You're talking about seizing private property. I'm talking about survival. Yours. Mine. The Empire's. If that requires taking from people who have more than they need to save people who have nothing, then yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The nobles in the room went pale. This was the line they'd been afraid she'd cross. The moment the revolution stopped being theoretical and started actually threatening their wealth. A baroness stood abruptly. This is theft, plain and simple. You're using crisis as an excuse to keep people alive? Yes, absolutely. And if you have a problem with that, there's the door. Walk out. Take your resources with you. See how long you last when the starving masses realize you let them die to protect your coin. The baroness sat back down. No one else moved. Because here was the thing about revolutions that most people conveniently forgot. They only worked if you were willing to follow through. If you were willing to burn down every comfortable structure and rebuild from ash. Half measures just created different versions of the same nightmare. And Selene was done with half measures. She'd spent 5 years as Lucian's instrument. 5 years making small compromises that added up to complicity and atrocity. 5 years telling herself she was doing the best she could under impossible circumstances. Now she understood the truth. There was no such thing as doing your best under tyranny. There was only resistance or collaboration, action or surrender, fighting with everything you had or becoming part of the machine that destroyed people. And she'd chosen her side, even if it killed her, even if it killed everyone. At least they'd die free. The council voted, barely passed. More than a third walked out in protest, but it passed. Within hours, servants were dispatched to inventory every noble estate within the capital. Guards were sent to secure granaries and warehouses. Merchants who'd been hoarding food waiting for prices to rise found their stores seized and redistributed. The backlash was immediate and vicious. By sunset, 3 council members had resigned. By midnight, 2 more noble families had barricaded themselves in their estates and declared they wouldn't comply. By dawn, fighting had broken out between loyalist guards and noble house security forces. The empire was tearing itself apart, and Selene stood in the center of it all, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life or the only choice that mattered. Kaelin found her on the palace battlements watching the city burn. "You should sleep." "Can't. Too much to do." "You've been awake for 3 days, 4 actually, but who's counting?" He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the bond they'd been dancing around for weeks. The mate connection that grew stronger every day they fought side by side. The recognition that went deeper than attraction or shared trauma. The knowledge that whatever happened next, they'd face it together. "We're losing," Kaelin said quietly. "I know. The Eastern Territories are turning other regions against us. Half the noble families are in open revolt. The Southern Kingdoms are hesitating on the trade agreements because they're not sure we'll survive long enough to honor the terms." "I know. So what's the plan?" She looked at him. Really looked. Saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the weight of command he'd never asked for. The soldier who'd become a leader because someone had to and no one else was willing. Saw the man who'd spent 3 years in the wilderness, hunted like an animal, and still chose to come back. Still chose to fight for people who'd branded him traitor. Still chose hope over bitterness, even when bitterness would have been easier. Saw her mate. The truth hit her with absolute certainty. Not her gift showing her, just the bone-deep recognition that some connections transcended reason. This was the man she'd spend her life with if they survived. The person who'd stand beside her in every battle. The partner who understood that some things were worth dying for. "The plan," she said finally, "is we hold the line until we can't anymore. We keep fighting, keep building, keep refusing to compromise on the things that matter. And if we lose, if the empire fractures and everything collapses, at least we'll know we tried." "That's not much of a plan. It's the only one I've got." Kaelin took her hand, laced his fingers through hers, let the contact spark the connection they'd both been avoiding acknowledging. She felt his emotions flood through her. Determination, fear, bone-deep exhaustion, and underneath it all, something that felt like love in its earliest, most dangerous form. The kind that made people reckless, that made them believe impossible things, that made them think maybe, just maybe, they could actually win against odds that should crush them. "Then I'm with you," he said. "Whatever comes, however it ends." She squeezed his hand. They stood on the battlements while the city burned below, and somewhere in the distance, armies gathered and the empire held its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The attack came 3 days later, not from the Eastern Territories like everyone expected. From inside the palace itself, noble families who'd seemed loyal had been quietly plotting, building alliances, waiting for the right moment to strike. They'd watched Selene seize their resources to feed the starving masses and decided she'd gone too far. Decided the revolution needed to be stopped before it actually changed anything. The assault began at dawn, coordinated, precise. House guards suddenly turning on loyalist forces, servants who'd been plants all along opening secret passages, nobles who'd voted with the council revealing themselves as traitors. Selene woke to the sound of steel on steel and people dying in the hallways. Kaelin was already moving, throwing on clothes and weapons with the efficiency of someone who'd lived combat for years. "Stay close to me." "Not likely." She grabbed the knife she'd started keeping under her pillow. "I'm not hiding while other people fight my battles. This isn't your battle. This is exactly my battle. They're coming for me. For what I represent. For the threat I pose to their comfortable corruption. All the more reason to... I spent 5 years being protected, being kept safe so Lucian could use me as his weapon. I'm done with that. If I'm going to lead this revolution, I lead from the front." The look he gave her was equal parts frustration and pride. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Probably. But I'll die fighting instead of cowering. That's progress." They moved through the palace together, gathering loyal guards, evacuating servants, trying to reach the council chambers where the remaining representatives were supposed to be fortifying their position. The hallways had become war zones. Bodies sprawled across marble floors. Blood painted across tapestries worth fortunes. guards fighting guards, while the entire structure of authority collapsed into chaos. Selene touched one of the attackers, letting her gift tear through his mind, saw the conspiracy laid out in brutal clarity. 20 noble families, all coordinating, all planning to eliminate the council and restore a more traditional power structure, with themselves in charge, naturally. They'd learned from Lucian's mistakes. No single tyrant, just a council of tyrants sharing power and making sure no one could challenge them. Same nightmare, different faces. She released him and kept moving. They reached the council chambers to find the doors barricaded and fighting raging inside. Kaelin kicked through the doors. The scene inside was carnage. Representatives fighting for their lives against noble house guards, the merchant guild leader bleeding out on the floor, the northern duke trying to hold a defensive position with 3 arrows sticking out of his shoulder. And at the center of it all, Lady Morgana. She'd escaped her confinement somehow. Now she stood with a blade in her hand and murder in her eyes, directing the assault like a general commanding troops. Her gaze found Selene across the chaos. You should have made the deal. Selene crossed the space between them, her knife ready, her gift screaming. I don't make deals with people who helped murder children. That was 30 years ago. Ancient history. Irrelevant to what? To your power grab? To your plan to replace one tyrant with 20? You think I don't see what this is? You think I don't understand that you're just trying to restore the system that let people like you thrive while everyone else suffered? Morgana smiled, cold, certain. I think you're a naive child playing at revolution. You have no idea what it takes to actually rule. No concept of the compromises necessary to keep an empire functioning. You're so busy pursuing your precious principles that you can't see you're destroying everything. Better destroyed than rotten. You'll change your mind when the bodies pile high enough, then I'll bury them myself. But I won't compromise. Won't become you. Won't spend my life justifying atrocity in the name of stability. They clashed. Not with weapons. Worse. With gifts. Morgana had power of her own, not mind reading like Selene. Something older, darker. The ability to inspire absolute loyalty in people around her, to make them believe her cause was worth dying for. It was how she'd survived 30 years, how she'd built her power base, how she'd turned loyal servants into saboteurs and guards into assassins. And now she turned that gift on Selene. The psychic assault hit like a hammer. Waves of compulsion crashing against Selene's consciousness. Commands wrapped in false certainty. The absolute conviction that Morgana was right, that compromise was necessary, that principles were luxuries only fools could afford. Selene felt her will bending, felt the commands taking root, felt herself starting to believe that maybe surrender was wisdom and fighting was just stubborn pride. Then she touched Morgana's hand, and her own gift tore through the compulsion like a blade through paper. She saw everything, every manipulation, every lie, every person Morgana had broken with her gift over 3 decades. Servants who'd betrayed their friends because Morgana made them believe it was right. Guards who'd murdered innocents because she convinced them it was necessary. Children who'd grown up twisted because she'd poisoned their minds young. Saw the monster hiding behind the facade of necessity. Saw that Morgana didn't believe her own justifications. She just enjoyed power and wanted to keep it. The revelation shattered the compulsion. Selene's gift exploded outward, not targeted like usual, not controlled, just raw psychic energy flooding through every mind in the chamber. Everyone felt it. Every person touched by Morgana's manipulation suddenly saw the truth, saw how they'd been used, saw the lies wrapped in false certainty, saw that they'd been fighting and killing for someone who viewed them as disposable tools. The noble house guards froze, looked at each other with dawning horror, looked at the people they'd just been trying to kill. Several dropped their weapons, others backed away. The unified assault fractured into confusion and guilt as the compulsion shattered and people remembered who they actually were. Morgana staggered backward, her face pale. What did you do? I showed them the truth, all of it, what you really are, what you made them do, how you twisted their minds to serve your ambition. You had no right. I had every right. You turned people into weapons. I just showed them the hand wielding them. Morgana's expression twisted into something ugly. You think you've won? You think exposing me changes anything? There are a dozen families just like mine, all of them with gifts, all of them with leverage, all of them watching to see if you can actually hold power or if you're just another idealist who'll break the moment reality hits. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when someone finally refuses to play by their rules. Kaelin appeared at her side, blood-covered but alive. The palace is secure. Most of the attackers surrendered once their leaders were exposed. Most? Some ran, headed for the eastern territories. They'll regroup, come back stronger, then we'll be ready. Morgana laughed, bitter, broken. You really believe that? You really think you can build something lasting on principles and hope? You're going to fail. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year. But eventually, you'll face a crisis where your precious truth isn't enough, where you have to choose between your ideals and survival. And when that moment comes, you'll make the same compromises everyone else makes, or you'll die. Maybe, Selene said quietly, but at least I'll die as myself, not as another tool for people like you. The guards took Morgana away. The council chamber fell silent except for the groans of wounded and the drip of blood on marble. Selene looked around at the carnage, at the representatives who'd survived, at Kaelin standing beside her covered in other people's blood, at the empire they were trying to save that kept trying to tear itself apart. This isn't over, she said. No, Kaelin agreed. It's just beginning. Because here was the truth that most people didn't understand about revolutions. The fighting part was easy. The hard part came after. The endless grinding work of actually building something new, of holding together a coalition of people who agreed they hated the old system but couldn't agree on what should replace it, of staying true to your principles when every single day brought a new crisis that made compromise look like wisdom. That was the real battle. And it would last years, decades, possibly the rest of their lives. But Selene had spent 5 years as a weapon. 5 years being used by someone who saw people as disposable resources in service of his own survival. She'd sworn she'd never be that again. Never compromise the things that actually mattered just to make her own life easier. Never become the monster just because fighting monsters was exhausting. And if that meant spending the rest of her life in the trenches fighting battles that never really ended, then fine. Better that than safety purchased through cowardice. The survivors began tending their wounded, clearing bodies, trying to restore some semblance of order from the chaos. Selene and Kaelin stood in the center of it all, hands clasped, covered in blood and exhaustion and the weight of impossible responsibility. The mate bond between them pulsed stronger with every passing moment, the recognition that they were in this together, that whatever horrors came next, they'd face them side by side. A messenger burst through the doors. My lady, Lord Kaelin, the Eastern Territories are mobilizing. 3 armies, heading for the capital. They'll be here within the month. Of course they were, because Morgana had been right about one thing. The families who'd built their power on corruption and manipulation weren't going to give up just because they'd been exposed. They were going to fight, with everything they had, until either the old system was restored or everyone involved was dead. How many soldiers, Kaelin asked. 15,000. Maybe more. Against? We have maybe 4,000 loyalists, less if more families defect once they see the size of the army coming. Selene felt ice in her stomach. They were outnumbered, out-resourced, surrounded by enemies inside and outside the capital. Any rational person would see this as the end, would recognize that the smart move was to negotiate, to compromise, to make whatever deals necessary to survive. But Selene had spent her entire adult life making those calculations, trading principles for survival, telling herself that living to fight another day was the same as actually fighting. And where had it gotten her? 5 years enabling a tyrant, 5 years with blood on her hands, 5 years becoming the exact thing she'd sworn she'd never be. No more. No more compromises. No more deals. No more accepting corruption because fighting it was too hard. This was the line, the moment, the place where she either stood for something or admitted that everything she'd said about truth and justice and building something better was just empty rhetoric. She looked at Kaelin. He looked back. Neither of them spoke, but the understanding passed between them anyway. They were going to fight. Against impossible odds. Against armies and nobles and the entire entrenched power structure that wanted them dead. They were going to fight and probably lose and die and be forgotten while the Empire went back to the same corruption that had created Lucian. But they were going to fight anyway, because some things were worth dying for. And building a world where people like Morgana couldn't turn others into weapons was one of them. Send word to the southern kingdoms, Selene commanded. Tell them we need their support now, not in 6 months when trade negotiations finish. Now. If they want allies against the eastern territories, this is their chance. They might not come. Then we fight alone. Kaelin gripped her hand tighter. Start fortifying the city. Every able-bodied person gets trained. Every building becomes a defensive position. We're going to make them bleed for every street. Against 15,000? Against 50,000? Against the whole damn empire, if that's what it takes. The messenger ran to carry out the orders. Selene and Kaelin stood alone in the council chamber, surrounded by blood and broken furniture, and the corpses of people who died for competing visions of what the empire should become. 1 month until the armies arrived. 1 month to prepare for a battle they couldn't win. 1 month to either build something worth dying for or admit that revolutions always failed because people like Morgana were right and principles were just expensive luxuries. Selene looked at the throne room visible through the open doors, at the place where Lucian had died, at the seat of power that had broken so many people who'd tried to wield it. She'd destroyed that throne. Literally. Had it torn down and melted into scrap metal the day after Lucian died. But the shape of it still haunted the room, the space where it had been, the absence that defined everything around it. Power didn't vanish just because you destroyed its symbols. It just waited. Patient. Eternal. For the next person desperate or ambitious or broken enough to reach for it. The question was whether you reached for it to serve yourself or to serve something bigger. Whether you became the throne or destroyed it over and over until maybe, eventually, people forgot it had ever existed. Selene made her choice. She would destroy it, every day, in every form, for as long as she lived, even if it killed her, even if it changed nothing. Even if she died forgotten while the empire went right back to its old patterns. At least she'd die trying. At least she'd die free. Kaelin squeezed her hand one more time. Then they got to work. 4 weeks to prepare for the end of everything. 4 weeks to either save the empire or go down fighting while it burned around them. 4 weeks until the eastern armies arrived and the real battle began. The battle that would decide whether truth could ever actually triumph over power. Or if people like Morgana were right, and corruption always won because it was willing to do whatever it took to survive. The city bells tolled evening prayers while the sun set over the capital, painting everything in blood-red light. 1 month until war. 1 month until everything they'd built either survived or shattered completely. 1 month until Selene discovered whether she was strong enough to hold the line when the whole world was burning. She looked at Kaelin, at the man who'd become her partner, her mate, her anchor in the storm. Ready? No. But let's do it anyway. They walked out of the council chamber into the chaos of a city preparing for siege, into the impossible task of building an army from scratch, into the desperate gamble that principles could somehow, against all evidence and history and common sense, actually matter when steel met flesh and people started dying, into the last stand that would either save everything or destroy it completely. And somewhere in the distance, 3 armies marched toward the capital, carrying the weight of the old empire and the determination to crush anyone who dared imagine something better. The revolution was about to face its final test. Win or die. Stand or break. Hold the line or watch everything burn. Selene had made her choice. Now she just had to survive long enough to see if it mattered. The eastern armies arrived on a morning that smelled like rain and iron. 15,000 soldiers spread across the hills surrounding the capital, like a dark tide ready to swallow everything in its path. Their banners showed the crests of 20 noble families united under a single cause, not loyalty to the empire, not justice or honor or any pretty lie, just the raw desire to restore a system that had served them well and punish the people who dared to challenge it. Selene stood on the city walls watching them assemble and felt something cold settle into her bones. This was it. The moment where principles met reality and one of them had to break. 4 weeks of preparation hadn't been enough. They'd fortified what they could, trained civilians who'd never held weapons, redistributed resources and built defensive positions, and done everything possible with the time and resources they had. But 4,000 defenders against 15,000 trained soldiers wasn't strategy. It was mathematics. And the mathematics said they were going to lose. Kalen appeared at her side, his armor dented from a week of constant drilling, his face etched with exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. The Southern Kingdom sent word. They're not coming. Of course they weren't. Because why would they risk their own armies to support a revolution that was already dying? Why throw resources at a lost cause when they could just wait for the dust to settle and negotiate with whoever won? So we're alone. Yeah. They stood in silence, watching the enemy forces spread out like a noose tightening. Here was the thing about last stands that the stories never quite captured. They weren't glorious, weren't heroic moments of clarity where everything suddenly made sense. They were just the exhausted acknowledgement that you'd run out of options and all that was left was to see how much damage you could do before the end. But humans were strange creatures. Give them a cause worth dying for, and they'd do things that made no rational sense. They'd stand when running was smarter, fight when surrender was safer, hold the line when breaking would save their lives, not because they were brave, because they'd finally found something that mattered more than survival. And that made them dangerous in ways no amount of soldiers could calculate. A messenger ran up the wall stairs, breathing hard. "My lady, the enemy has sent an envoy. They want to negotiate." Selene and Kalen exchanged glances. "Send them in." The envoy arrived under flag of truce, a nobleman Selene vaguely recognized from one of the families that had walked out of the council. He looked nervous, like he'd drawn the short straw on assignments and was terrified of getting his throat cut. He bowed stiffly. The allied families offer terms. Stand down. Surrender the Revolutionary Council. Submit to trial for the murder of King Lucian and the unlawful seizure of noble property. In exchange, the common citizens will be spared and the city will not be sacked. And if we refuse, then they'll take the city by force. Every person who resisted will be executed. Every family that supported you will be eliminated. The capital will burn as an example to anyone else who thinks rebellion is acceptable. Selene felt something like calm settle over her. Here was the choice laid bare. Surrender and die alone. Or fight and take everyone with her. The old Selene would have agonized over it, would have calculated every angle looking for the option that saved the most lives, would have found some way to compromise and tell herself it was wisdom instead of cowardice. But 5 years as Lucian's weapon had taught her something crucial about the nature of power. It didn't respect hedged bets, didn't negotiate with people who were afraid to commit. It only understood absolute conviction and the willingness to follow through regardless of cost. Tell them we refuse. The envoy's face went white. "My lady, please reconsider. Think of the innocent people who will die." "I'm thinking of them. I'm thinking about what kind of world they'll live in if we surrender. What kind of empire gets rebuilt if corruption wins because good people were too afraid to fight back? This is suicide. Maybe. But it's our choice to make, not yours. Not the families who think they can threaten us into submission. Ours." The envoy opened his mouth to argue further, then thought better of it. He bowed again and fled down the wall stairs like death itself was chasing him. Kalen watched him go. "You know what this means. I know. No Southern support, no reinforcements, no miracle rescue. Just us against 15,000 soldiers who are going to tear this city apart." "Yes. And you're okay with that?" She looked at him, really looked, at the man who'd become her partner in revolution and something deeper. The mate bond between them had grown so strong over the past month that she could feel his emotions like her own. His fear, his determination, his absolute refusal to run even though running was the smart play. "I'm not okay with any of this, but I stopped making decisions based on what I could live with. Now I make them based on what I can die for. And this," she gestured at the city behind them, "all those people who chose to stay and fight instead of surrender, this is worth dying for. Even if we lose? Especially if we lose. Because the only thing worse than dying for what you believe in is living while pretending you believe in nothing." He took her hand, laced his fingers through hers. Let the mate bond flare between them, that recognition that went deeper than words. Then let's make them remember us. The attack began an hour later. The Eastern armies didn't bother with subtlety or strategy. They had overwhelming numbers and everyone knew it. So they just came straight at the walls like a hammer designed to shatter stone. Arrows fell like rain. Siege equipment rolled forward. Soldiers screamed battle cries while defenders screamed back, and the whole thing devolved into chaos and violence and the fundamental insanity of humans killing each other over competing visions of how society should work. Selene fought on the walls with a sword she barely knew how to use and her gift burning through her consciousness like wildfire. Every person she touched flooded her with their memories, their fears, their desperate determination to survive or die trying. She saw soldiers who'd been conscripted against their will, fighting because their families would be punished if they deserted. Saw nobles who genuinely believed they were restoring order to a chaotic empire. Saw opportunists who just wanted the looting rights once the city fell. Saw that most of the people trying to kill her weren't monsters, just humans caught in systems bigger than themselves, making choices that seemed rational from inside their own limited perspectives. And she killed them anyway. Because that was war. Not noble or clean or justified by grand principles. Just the grinding horror of people destroying each other while both sides convinced themselves they were righteous. The walls held through the first day. Barely. Bodies piled at the base while defenders scrambled to reinforce weak points and tend the wounded and keep fighting even as exhaustion turned their limbs to lead. Night brought no relief. The Eastern armies lit massive bonfires and kept the pressure on, giving defenders no chance to rest or recover or do anything except endure. Selene found Kaelin in a guard tower, blood-covered and hollow-eyed, staring out at the enemy campfires. How many did we lose? 300, maybe more. Hard to get accurate counts. Against? Maybe 1,000. But they have 15 times our numbers. They can afford losses we can't. The mathematics of attrition. Cold. Brutal. Inevitable. How long can we hold? Another day. 2 if we're lucky. And then? Then they breach the walls and it becomes street fighting. We make them pay for every building, every alley, every single inch of ground until there's nothing left to take. That's not victory. No, but it's not surrender either. They sat in silence while the city burned in patches, and people screamed, and the whole nightmarish machinery of war ground forward. Do you regret it? Kaelin asked quietly. Any of it? Selene thought about the question. Really thought. Did she regret exposing Lucian? No. He'd been a monster, and the Empire deserved to know. Did she regret refusing to compromise with families like Morgana's? No. Building something better required actually being better, not just rearranging which tyrants held power. Did she regret the people dying right now because of choices she'd made? Yes. Every single one. Their deaths sat on her conscience like physical weight, crushing down, making it hard to breathe. But regret wasn't the same as wishing she'd chosen differently. No, she said finally, I don't regret it. I regret that it came to this, that the system was so broken that tearing it down meant war. But I don't regret trying. Even knowing we're going to lose, we haven't lost yet. Selene. His voice carried all the weight of unspoken truth. They both knew how this ended, how it had to end. The mathematics were too clear. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not while people were still fighting. Not while there was still a chance, however slim, that something might shift. The second day was worse than the first. The Eastern armies brought siege towers and battering rams, concentrated their forces on the weakest sections of wall, threw bodies at the defenses in waves that didn't stop until they'd achieved breakthrough. The walls fell an hour before sunset. Selene watched from a secondary position as enemy soldiers poured through the breach like floodwater, spreading into the streets, beginning the brutal work of taking the city building by building. This was it, the beginning of the end. Kaelin organized the retreat, pulling defenders back to prepared positions, setting up kill zones and ambush points. They'd planned for this. Knew the walls would eventually fall, had strategies for making the Eastern armies bleed for every street, but strategy only delayed the inevitable. By nightfall, a quarter of the city was in enemy hands. By midnight, half. By dawn, 3/4. The defenders fell back to the palace, the last stronghold, the final position. 2,000 survivors out of the 4,000 who'd started, exhausted, wounded, running on nothing but stubborn refusal to quit. The Eastern armies surrounded the palace and stopped. Not because they were afraid, because they'd won and everyone knew it. They could afford to wait, to let fear and exhaustion do the work for them. An envoy came again. Different nobleman this time. Older, more confident. The terms are the same. Surrender the Revolutionary Council. Stand trial. Spare the remaining defenders. Selene stood in the throne room where this had all started, where she'd exposed Lucian, where she'd destroyed the crown and sworn the old system would never return. Blood stained the marble floor. Bodies lined the walls. The survivors looked at her with expressions that mixed hope and despair and bone-deep weariness. She could end this, right now. Surrender herself and maybe, possibly, save their lives. Let the old families restore their power. Let corruption win. Let everything she'd fought for die so that people who'd chosen to stand with her could keep breathing. It was the practical choice, the smart choice, the choice that minimized total suffering. It was also exactly what Lucian would have wanted her to do. Prove that principles were just expensive luxuries. That power always won in the end. That fighting the system was futile because the system was too big to break. She looked at Kalen. He looked back with absolute understanding. The choice was hers. He'd follow whatever she decided. Fight until death or surrender and face trial. Either way, he was with her. The mate bond between them pulsed stronger. Not just recognition anymore. Full connection. The kind that bound people together across lifetimes. The kind that meant whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Selene turned to the envoy. Tell them we need an hour to discuss terms. The envoy bowed and left. The moment he was gone, Selene addressed the remaining defenders. Anyone who wants to leave, go. No judgment, no shame. You fought brilliantly. You stood when others ran. You have nothing left to prove. A third of them took her up on the offer. Filed out through a side entrance the Eastern armies were letting them use. Civilians mostly. People who'd taken up arms because they believed in the cause but had families waiting, children who needed parents, lives that shouldn't end in a last stand. Selene watched them go and felt relief. Better that than everyone dying for her stubbornness. The remaining defenders stayed because they'd made the same calculation she had. Some things mattered more than survival. She climbed to the highest tower of the palace, the same obsidian tower where Lucian had threatened her months ago, where he'd tried to force her compliance through fear. The view showed the whole city, broken, burning, occupied by armies loyal to families who'd spend the next decade rebuilding exactly the same corrupt system that had created Lucian. All of this, all the fighting and dying and desperate hoping, for nothing. The revolution had failed, not because they weren't brave enough or smart enough or committed enough, because the weight of entrenched power was too heavy for principles to lift. Kalen found her there, staring out at the wreckage. What are you thinking? That maybe Morgana was right. Maybe truth is just a luxury. Maybe power always wins because it's willing to do whatever it takes. You don't believe that, don't I? Look at what we accomplished. We exposed a tyrant and started a civil war. We held the line on principles and got thousands of people killed. We refused to compromise, and now the same families we fought against are going to rule for another generation. What was the point? The point was we tried. We stood up. We proved that resistance is possible even if it doesn't succeed. But it didn't change anything. It changed you. It changed everyone who fought here. It changed the story people will tell about what happened. That matters. Does it? Or is that just what we tell ourselves so dying for nothing feels noble? Kalen took her hands, forced her to look at him. 5 years ago, you were Lucian's weapon. You helped him destroy people because you were too afraid to refuse. Now you're standing in a burning city because you refuse to become that again. That's not nothing. That's everything. The words cracked something inside her chest, because he was right. She had changed, had transformed from weapon to warrior, from tool to leader, from someone who accepted whatever role power assigned her to someone who chose her own path, even when that path led straight into hell. That was worth something. Maybe not victory, maybe not saving the empire, but worth the attempt. She kissed him. Hard, desperate. A promise sealed against his mouth that whatever happened in the next hour, she was grateful he'd been there. Grateful they'd found each other. Grateful the mate bond had given her someone to stand beside at the end. When they broke apart, his eyes held the same gratitude mixed with sorrow. What's the plan? She smiled. Small, sad. We're going to do what we should have done from the beginning. We're going to show them exactly what happens when you push people who have nothing left to lose. They descended the tower together, gathered the remaining defenders in the throne room. Selene stood at the center and addressed them one final time. The Eastern armies think they've won. They think surrounding us means we'll surrender. They think fear will break us like it broke everyone else who ever challenged them. Her voice grew stronger. They're wrong. We're not surrendering. We're not giving them the satisfaction of trials and executions and public displays of dominance. Instead, we're going to walk out those doors, every single one of us. And we're going to use our gifts, our weapons, our bare hands, if that's what it takes, to make them understand that crushing resistance just creates more resistance. This is suicide, someone said. Not accusing, just stating fact. Yes, but it's our choice, our terms, our refusal to let them write the ending. She looked around at the faces staring back, young and old, noble and common. People who'd come together because they believed the empire could be something better than what it was. They'd failed to change the system, but they'd succeeded at proving the system could be challenged, that truth could stand against power even if it didn't triumph, that principles meant something even when they cost everything. That was the legacy. Not victory, defiance. The defenders prepared in silence, armed themselves with whatever weapons remained, made peace with the knowledge that the next hour would be their last. Selene and Kaelin stood side by side near the palace doors. The mate bond between them had reached full strength now. She could feel his heart beating in sync with hers, could sense his emotions as clearly as her own, could know with absolute certainty that he didn't regret any of it. Not the fighting, not the dying, not the choice to stand beside her at the end. She touched his face gently. I love you. Should have said it sooner. Should have said it every day since we met, but I'm saying it now. I know. His hand covered hers. I've known since the moment you freed me from that cell. Some recognitions don't need words. If there's another life after this, then I'll find you, and we'll do it all again. Make all the same choices, fight all the same battles, because that's who we are. Stubborn idiots who don't know when to quit. Exactly. They kissed one more time. Then Selene opened the palace doors. The Eastern armies waited outside in perfect formation. Thousands of soldiers arranged in defensive positions, ready for a desperate last charge from a beaten enemy. What they weren't ready for was something different. Selene stepped through the doors alone, hands raised, no weapons, just her gift burning through her consciousness like a star going nova. She reached out with her power, not targeted at one person, not controlled like usual, just raw psychic energy flooding outward in waves. Every soldier in the courtyard felt it slam into their minds. She showed them everything, every atrocity committed by the noble families they served, every murdered child, every starved village, every calculated cruelty designed to maintain power structures that ground people into dust. Showed them Lucian's crimes, Morgana's manipulations, the 30-year conspiracy that had built the current empire on foundations of blood and lies. Showed them what they were really fighting for. Not order, not stability, not protection, just the privilege of corrupt families to keep exploiting everyone below them on the hierarchy. The psychic assault lasted seconds but felt like hours. When it ended, soldiers staggered. Some dropped weapons. Others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of understanding. Not all of them. Some had seen the truth and chosen corruption anyway. Some genuinely believed the old system was better than the chaos of change. But enough wavered, enough hesitated, enough stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just felt. That was the opening. Kaelin led the remaining defenders through the doors in a wedge formation, not charging blindly, moving with purpose, making for the gaps in the enemy lines where confusion had created vulnerability. The fighting that followed was brutal, desperate, exactly as suicidal as everyone had known it would be. But it wasn't a massacre, because some of the Eastern soldiers chose not to fight, chose to step aside and let the revolutionaries through, chose questioning over blind obedience. Selene fought in the center of the formation, her gift tearing through minds while her body moved on instinct and training that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She knew she was going to die, knew Kaelin was going to die, knew all of this would ultimately accomplish nothing except proving that resistance existed. But in that moment, fighting beside people who'd chosen the same impossible path, she felt something like peace. This was who she'd always been underneath the fear. This was the person Lucian had tried to bury under 5 years of conditioning, the woman who chose truth over safety, principles over survival, defiance over submission. Finding her had cost everything. But it was worth the price, An arrow caught her in the shoulder. She stumbled, kept moving. More impacts. Blade, blunt force. Pain registering distantly, like it was happening to someone else. Kaylin was beside her, bleeding from a dozen wounds, still fighting. The defenders were falling one by one, but they were taking Eastern soldiers with them, making them pay, proving that crushing people who had nothing left to lose came with a cost. Selene's vision started going dark at the edges, blood loss catching up, body shutting down. She reached for Kaylin's hand one last time, found it, felt the mate bond flare between them like lightning. "Worth it," she managed to say. "Yeah," he agreed, "worth all of it." Then the darkness took her. She woke in a bed that felt too soft, blankets that smelled clean, light filtering through windows that suggested days had passed. Her body screamed pain when she tried to move. Bandages covered what felt like half her torso. Her shoulder throbbed where the arrow had hit. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, alive. Kaylin sat beside the bed, his own collection of bandages visible under his shirt. He looked exhausted but whole, breathing, present. What happened? The Eastern armies fractured. What you did, showing them the truth, it broke something. Half their soldiers refused to keep fighting. Some even joined us. The noble families tried to maintain control but couldn't. Without unified military support, they collapsed. So we won? Not exactly. The empire is still fragmenting. The eastern territories are independent now. So are half the others. But the capital survived. The revolution survived. And the families that orchestrated the attack are in chains awaiting trial. Selene processed this slowly. It felt too much like victory when she'd been certain they'd die. How many? Of our defenders? Maybe 300 survived. Out of 2,000. He paused. But the city guard mostly stayed loyal. Civilians are already rebuilding. And representatives from neutral territories are asking about the Truth Council, wanting to know if the offer still stands. The Truth Council. The system they'd tried to build. Governance based on transparency instead of fear. It had survived, barely, but survived. "We didn't change everything," Kaylin said quietly. "Most of the empire still operates the old way. Corruption is still rampant. Power structures are still intact in places we couldn't reach. But we changed something, proved it was possible to challenge the system and survive. That's not the revolution we wanted. No, but it's the one we got. And maybe that's enough. Maybe change happens slowly. One battle at a time, one territory at a time, one person choosing truth over convenience." Selene lay back against the pillows, exhausted and aching and alive against all odds. She thought about everything they'd lost, the thousands dead, the empire fractured, the incomplete victory that felt more like survival than triumph. Thought about what they'd gained, freedom from Lucian's shadow, proof that resistance was possible. A foothold for building something better, even if better was still decades away. Thought about the choice she'd made to stand instead of surrender, to fight instead of compromise, to become herself instead of the weapon others wanted her to be. That transformation had cost everything, but looking at Kaylin, seeing the mate bond still burning bright between them, feeling the ache in her body that meant she'd survive to keep fighting, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some prices were worth paying. Weeks passed, then months. The slow grinding work of rebuilding began. The Truth Council expanded, not just the capital anymore. 3 territories joined, then 5, then 8, slowly, carefully, but growing. Every representative submitted to Selene's reading, full transparency, no secrets. It became the foundation of the new system. Not perfect, not complete, but different enough to matter. Selene and Kaylin led together. Not as king and queen. Those titles died with Lucian, just as partners trying to build something that served people instead of consuming them. The mate bond between them deepened into something that went beyond romance into true partnership. They fought, disagreed, made different calls, but always came back to the fundamental alignment that had brought them together. The shared conviction that some things were worth dying for, which meant they were worth living for too. 1 year after the battle, Selene stood in the rebuilt council chamber addressing representatives from 12 territories. "What we're building won't be finished in our lifetime," she told them. "Maybe not in our children's lifetimes. Changing systems that have existed for centuries takes generations. But every person we help, every corrupt family we expose, Every choice we make to tell the truth instead of the convenient lie. That matters. That moves us forward. She looked around at the faces staring back. Some believed her, some were skeptical. Some were probably still corrupt and just hiding it better. But they were trying, all of them, trying to create something that valued truth over power. That was revolutionary enough. After the session, she walked through the palace gardens. They'd been overgrown during the war. Now servants were slowly bringing them back, planting flowers, trimming hedges, choosing beauty over utility. Kaelin found her there, sitting on a bench, watching the sunset paint everything gold. Thinking about anything in particular? Just how different everything is. A year ago, I thought we'd all be dead. Now we're here, alive, still fighting, still building. Regret it? She smiled, not for a second. He sat beside her, took her hand, let the mate bond flow between them, that recognition that some connections transcended explanation. I love you, he said. Should say it more often, should say it every day. I know. She leaned against his shoulder. I've always known. They sat in comfortable silence while the sun set and the city lights began flickering on below. Thousands of lives continuing. Thousands of people living under a system that was slowly, painfully becoming less cruel. It wasn't the revolution Selene had dreamed of, wasn't the complete transformation that would erase all corruption and suffering. But it was real. It was progress. It was proof that change was possible even when the odds said it wasn't. And sometimes that was enough. Selene had spent 5 years as a weapon. 5 years believing her only value was the gift that let her expose lies. 5 years thinking power defined her worth. Now she understood the truth. Her value wasn't the gift. It was the choice. The decision to stand when falling was easier, to fight when surrendering was smarter, to believe in something bigger than survival even when survival was all most people could manage. That choice couldn't be taken from her, couldn't be corrupted, couldn't be turned into a weapon against others. It was hers. Absolutely. Completely. And once she'd claimed it, nothing could make her give it back. Years later, people would tell stories about the weapon queen who destroyed a tyrant from inside his throne room, who started a revolution with a single touch, who refused to compromise even when compromise would have saved her life. The stories would get details wrong, would make her braver than she'd been, would ignore the fear and doubt and desperate hoping that had actually driven her choices. But they'd get one thing right. She'd chosen truth over safety, principles over power, humanity over the role others assigned her. And that choice had changed everything. Not all at once, not completely, not in the perfect way stories usually ended, but enough. In small ways that accumulated into something larger, in territories that chose transparency, in people who stood up because they'd seen someone else stand first, in systems that slowly, grudgingly, became less willing to crush resistance because resistance had proven it could survive. The empire would never be perfect. Corruption would always exist. Power would always tempt people into cruelty. But now there was an alternative. Proof that another way was possible. Evidence that choosing differently could work even if it cost everything. Selene had paid that cost, had survived it, had built something worth having from the ashes of what she'd destroyed. And if that wasn't victory, it was close enough to matter. She stood from the garden bench, Kaelin's hand still in hers, and walked back toward the palace, where representatives waited and decisions needed making, and the slow work of governance ground forward. Walked toward the future she'd chosen, the life she'd built, the person she'd become by refusing to be the weapon anyone else designed. Walked knowing that some transformations couldn't be reversed. That once you'd seen yourself clearly, once you'd chosen who you were going to be, nothing could make you go back to being the tool in someone else's hand. That was freedom, real freedom. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice. And for someone who'd spent 5 years without it, choice was worth everything. The city bells tolled evening while stars began appearing overhead. Another day ending, another day survived, another day of building something that might, eventually, generations from now, become the empire people deserved instead of the one they'd inherited. Selene squeezed Kaelin's hand once more. Then they walked inside together to face whatever came next. Not as king and queen, not as rulers or weapons or anything except themselves. Just two people who'd learned that the hardest battles weren't fought with swords or gifts or 8 armies. They were fought in the moment you decided who you were going to be and refused to compromise on that truth no matter what it cost. And once you won that battle, once you claimed yourself completely, nothing could ever make you a weapon again. That was the real victory. Not changing the empire, changing yourself, not destroying power, choosing what kind of power you'd wield, not winning every fight, learning which fights were worth losing for. Selene had learned, had transformed, had become exactly the thing Lucian feared most. Not a perfect hero, not a flawless revolutionary, just a woman who decided that some things mattered more than survival and lived accordingly. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. Everything.